Shana Tova, good Yontif, and Gamar Chatima Tova. May this day of Yom Kippur be a fruitful culmination of the High Holy Day season for you. Welcome to the second installment of our virtual sermon situation this year, and again, I apologize in advance for any pet sounds that may intrude over the course of this recording. We are now 10 days into the new Jewish year, something which is not at all news to a majority of the Jewish community. What's less well known in the community is the particular number that's assigned to this new year, traditionally reckoned to be a measure of time since the creation of the universe. This year's number within that reckoning is a fairly unremarkable 5,781. Not nearly as interesting a number as, shall we say, the current Gregorian year of 2020. But the numerical values of the Jewish year, they've never been their most interesting aspect. What's always been more intriguing is that each number is also a specific Hebrew word. That's because in traditional Jewish culture, each letter of the alphabet has both a linguistic and a numerical significance. So numbers are always represented by letters, which means that all words have a mathematical dimension and all numbers a semantic one. The most widely recognized example of this in modern Jewish culture is that the Hebrew word for life, or chai, is made up of two letters whose sum is equal to the number 18. A widespread practice within the traditional Jewish world as the new year approaches is to analyze the meaning of that year's numerically based name. This is seen as a way of predicting which themes and issues will be most prominent in the world during the ensuing 12 months. If the numerical order of the letters proves at all difficult to interpret, it's seen as perfectly kosher to rearrange them, if doing so seems to yield an even clearer linguistic message. Now, I can say with some definitiveness that I don't personally believe in the predictive power of the Hebrew letters that describe the calendar year. But I will also confess that when I realized what this Hebrew year of 5781 could be translated into semantically, I found it unexpectedly captivating. So it turns out that the letters forming the year 5781, Tav, Shin, Pei, Aleph, in a slightly rearranged order, spell the Hebrew verb tish'af, which bears two meanings: to inhale and to aspire. To inhale and to aspire. Could any two words more meaningfully resonate with the core issues and challenges that are currently facing our nation and our world? Could there be a more powerful statement at this moment about the direction we need to move in as a society and as a species than one that elevates the imagery of breathing and of hopefulness? We know that in terms of our physiology, breathing is perhaps our most basic function, a necessary precondition to engaging with life in a way that generates meaning and relationship. In situations where our breathing is inhibited either by an external circumstance or internally due to the presence of stress or anxiety, we have a much harder time handling whatever else is going on in our lives at that moment. To take a biblical example, When Moses first brings God's dramatic message of liberation to the enslaved Israelites in Egypt, we are told that they are not able to hear it because of their kotzer ruach, a phrase often translated as anguished spirit, but that could just as easily be rendered as their shortness of breath. We also know that in many ancient languages, including Hebrew, Sanskrit, and Latin, the word for breath and the word for soul are one and the same. This linguistic association conveys a teaching about breathing as the basis for life at its most vital, and conversely, that greater personal and communal depths of engagement form the pathway to breathing freely in both a literal and metaphorical sense. The name of this year seems to hold out the potential that in the coming months, these two central aspects of our spiritual and biological vitality, which have of late been under threat, might be reclaimed. This motif of breathing has appeared in our world in multiple ways over the course of recent months and brought many challenges that we face as a country and as a species into much clearer focus than they had previously been. Today I'd like to mention three of them, none of which will be surprising to anyone. First, the COVID-19 pandemic. We are facing a disease that, above all, attacks our very ability to breathe. Its threat and impact have been met with a series of ambiguous and ambivalent responses by our national leadership. This profound failure has in turn resulted in perhaps millions of unnecessary illnesses and many tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths among our citizens. Even the way that we protect ourselves and one another from this disease results in a certain level of constraint on our breathing in the form of wearing a mask. The more effective the mask is at preventing the spread of the virus, the more we feel the respiratory restriction in our breathing. From a more holistic perspective, our ability to breathe freely in both a literal and symbolic sense has been impacted by the higher amount of stress and anxiety in our lives, engendered by concern over the very possibility of infection, and fueled by anticipatory worry. Our sympathetic nervous systems have remained on high alert and kept our breathing shallow and labored. The emergence of COVID-19 has undeniably stirred up greater uncertainty in our lives and in our world, an issue which I spoke about at some length on Rosh Hashanah. But it has paradoxically had the opposite effect as well, dispelling some of the fog in our national awareness and bringing greater clarity to both the difficult and potentially generative truths that have for too long been kept off the main stage of our public conversations. On the most macro level, the virus has driven home the until recently purely academic idea that we are all connected and interdependent. We have learned and continue to see every day how a series of seemingly private individual choices can generate large effects on the safety and well-being of a collective. This new and welcome awareness has led to the proliferation of a clarion call across many media platforms and news outlets, proclaiming that we're all in this together. That phrase is true up to a certain point. But there has also been critique of this language because of the way it obscures some very real and shocking disparities between different subsets of the American population. One writer has suggested modifying this message and framing it in this more nuanced way. We are all caught in the same storm, but we're in very different kinds of boats. In this framing, our chances of surviving the storm or of not being seriously injured along the way are directly related to the size, quality, and equipment of the vessel that we're riding in. There are many ways we could unpack this metaphor, but to take just three of the most evident, let's reflect on the categories of living conditions, access to health care, and types of employment. First, disparate living conditions. Those with fewer resources tend to live in more crowded contexts, and we know that the virus spreads more easily when people are in closer proximity to one another. While those who have means are able to escape this closeness, fleeing the major cities across the country for more remote and spacious accommodations, reducing their risk of exposure. Second, access to health care. Those who live in poorer areas of the country generally have a more difficult time accessing medical professionals and medical resources, such as prescription drugs, both from a logistical and a financial point of view. And beyond this, those living closer to or below the poverty line are typically serviced by medical systems that have less capacity to respond to a sudden wave of illness, a situation which all by itself raises the mortality rate for people who contract COVID. Third, the nature of one's employment. Those with higher paying jobs are generally much more likely to have the option of transitioning to a home-based virtual work environment. However, the majority of those in lower paying jobs, many of which the government has categorized as essential, are in the position of continuing to work in roles that require much more interpersonal contact and thus are put at a much greater risk of infection. What all of these factors add up to is the tragic and deeply unfair, but not surprising result that many minority communities are suffering an outsized share of the virus's impact in terms of illness and death, due to the higher percentage of their members being condemned to using vastly inferior boats in this virus-driven storm. This, then, is another kind of clarity that the presence of the virus has generated in our lives. It has shined a bright light on collective systems and structures that have, for far too long, been willfully ignored by society at large. Structures that perpetuate the realities of racial injustice and unnecessary suffering. Even as these structures have officially been disavowed, their searing and insidious impact has been plainly disclosed through the disproportionate impact of the pandemic felt by many minority communities in our country, especially African Americans. A second recent expression of the breathing motif emerged from the horrific public execution of George Floyd by a group of 4 Minneapolis police officers at the end of May. The video taken by a young witness to the murder went viral on the internet. Tragically, George Floyd's case is far from unusual. In 2020 alone, there have already been a large number of such incidents in which African Americans have had their lives stolen away at the hands of police officers, or by those claiming to act in their stead. These include the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor in the months preceding the killing of George Floyd, and several others that have taken place in the months since that time, including those of Rayshard Brooks and Jacob Blake. What was it about George Floyd that's generated the intensity and breadth of the national and global uproar, that has inspired the calling out of widespread bigotry undergirding the police brutality suffered by so many African Americans? Perhaps it was the astonishingly casual demeanor with which former officer Derek Chauvin kept his knee and the weight of his body on George Floyd's neck for close to 8 minutes, as Floyd pleaded over and over again for his life. Perhaps it was the way the video captured several attempts of civilians in the area to get Chauvin to back off, only to have their concerns paternalistically rebuffed by the police on the scene. Perhaps it was the heartrending content of those pleas themselves in the closing moments of Floyd's life, including the statement that has since become a rallying cry for a revitalized and broadly diverse movement for Black lives of, "I can't breathe." These occurrences are not random or exceptional. According to the Washington Post, Black Americans die in encounters with police at more than 2 times the rate of white Americans. This reality emerges out of the historical structures of our society, and they must be addressed in order for Americans of color, and in truth, for all Americans, to breathe freely in the way we know is the birthright of all human beings. The third and final expression of the breathing motif in our current reality that I will briefly touch on is connected with the ongoing climate crisis and the global ecological breakdown that it's generating. We can see 2 manifestations of the motif in this context. The first is occurring in very concrete ways as changing climate patterns bring about a higher percentage of extreme weather events, such as the unusually hot and dry conditions that set the stage perfectly for large and dangerous wildfires. Such fires took place earlier this year in Australia, and we have been witness to a similar situation more recently in Northern California and the Pacific Northwest. Besides the threat to life, property, and habitat that these events bring in their wake, there is an additional danger posed due to smoke inhalation. Public health authorities recommend that people simply remain inside their homes during a wildfire-induced air quality emergency, and that if people must go out for any reason, that they should wear an N95 mask to protect themselves from the danger that smoke particles pose to their lungs. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, those masks are being reserved for healthcare workers and are not generally available to the public at large. The second ecological manifestation of the breathing motif is an overarching description of planetary well-being in terms of the basic breathing process. As Rabbi Arthur Waskow recently expressed it, all life on Earth depends on interbreathing. Plants breathe in carbon dioxide, breathe out oxygen. Animals breathe in oxygen, breathe out carbon dioxide. Our interbreathing is the breath that keeps all Earth alive. The ability to breathe at the most expansive level is about the interconnectedness and sustainability of life on Earth as we know it. So this has been an extensive and perhaps overwhelming reflection on the first meaning of the Hebrew word derived from the spelling of the number 5781. But what about the second meaning of this New Year's numerically coded name? The meaning of aspiration. How can we see that as being part of the larger picture that has been unfolding over the past 3/4 of a year and pointing us toward the future? Part of the answer to that question can be found in a concept that was developed at a Midwestern think tank in the mid-1990s. The name of this concept is the Overton Window, coined in honor of its developer. The idea is not complex, but its explanatory power is compelling. It states that, contrary to many popular theories of leadership, politicians are generally limited to a certain range of policy options by the beliefs of their constituents. No matter what direction a political leader thinks may be the best for our society, he or she must operate within a given acceptable range of options, or risk being ousted from their position. This concept of the Overton Window describes this range of publicly acceptable policies at any given historical moment. From this perspective, authentic societal change only comes about when the citizenry enters a state of readiness, whether due to external events or some type of below-the-surface cultural evolution. It's at such moments, the theory says, that the Overton window shifts and opens and expands. Many cultural observers are convinced that we have recently entered one of those windows of opportunity due to the multiple crises simultaneously confronting our society and our planet. Public health, unaddressed racial injustice, economic contraction and dislocation, extreme political polarization, increasingly and unprecedentedly severe weather and climate-related events. The good news is that with the position of the Overton window in flux, there are real opportunities to reshape the conversation and the policy direction in our society in relationship to all of these issues. Most especially, the urgent need to address the historical impediments and structural risks faced by African Americans and other people of color in our country, and the comparably urgent need to move away from a fossil fuel-driven economy as a first crucial step in truly addressing our planetary ecological and climate crises. The bad news is that with our society existing at such a high degree of fluidity, there is also a danger that we could move in a very different, retrogressive direction. The potentially good, but also very challenging news is that the direction we end up taking collectively will be determined by which vision of our future can generate the most energy and resolve at this sensitive moment. If ever there was a time to push ourselves into some kind of active engagement on issues that impact on our lives and that touch our hearts, this is that time. The stakes are incredibly high. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the long-term well-being of our species, indeed our planet, hangs in the balance. However, the potential for transformation in how we see one another, how we move towards a global framework of sustainability, and how we engage with and act on calls for justice is similarly profound. In the words of the poet Adrienne Rich, what would it mean to live in a city whose people were changing each other's despair into hope? You yourself must change it. What would it feel like to know that your country was changing? You yourself must change it. Though your life feels arduous, new and unmapped and strange, what would it mean to stand on the first page of the end of despair? We are all being called to an immense undertaking in this moment. We are being called to claim for each other and for ourselves our collective right to breathe in the fullest sense of that term, to assert our collective need to live lives driven by hope rather than by fear, and to actively envision and pursue new societal structures that will enhance rather than undermine our movement towards a future of greater possibility and wholeness. In Hebrew, there is a word, mashber, that comes from the root meaning to shatter or to break. It can be translated as both crisis and birthing stool, a time of collapse or a time of emergence. It is up to all of us to determine which interpretation will define our path forward. May we together discover and embrace the courage and the hope that will enable us to respond to this call in a way that says yes to life for all of us in the present moment at this crucial historical time, and also for many generations yet to come. Good Yontif, Shana Tova, and a meaningful fast.